First of all, would we have for being a few minutes late, being the day that's in it, unfortunately, a few things to do. Apologies from Rory Quinn and from Senator David Norris for today's meeting. Draft minutes of the meeting of the 11th of November 2004 have been circulated. Are the minutes agreed? Thank you. Unless there are other minutes rising from this, we'll proceed with the main business of the meeting. That's the presentation from Dr. Nader Hashemi on Syria, ISIS. So we'll get him in. Dr. Hashemi, can I apologise to you for being a few minutes late?
No, I understand how parliaments work. No need to apologise.
There's a few urgent business on today in relation to a certain commodity, so it's been discussed and debated in the Dáil at 3 p.m. So we're going to try and get the meeting started as quickly as possible, because I know some of the members have to go to that. So we're now in public session, and I want to welcome Dr. Hashemi from the University of Denver. Of course, we're all appalled by the ongoing situation in Syria and the parallel rise, the rise of the Islamic State, which is causing great concern to everybody throughout the world, and particularly to the committee here itself. And we've seen the worst affected areas. We've seen the atrocities, the killings, the inhuman acts that are being carried out at the moment. And of course, the people that are affected by all this are the citizens of Syria, plus the, unfortunately, outsiders, the humanitarian workers and the reporters that have been caught up in all this. This is affecting, is affecting other countries as well in the region, with Iraq as well. So there's extensive focus being on this in the UN, in the EU, and yet there seems to be no sign of improvement in the area. In fact, it's probably getting worse. So the format of today's meeting is that we would hear an opening statement from Dr. Hashemi before we go into a Q&A with members of the committee itself. Now, I know that Dr. Hashemi's statement has been sent around to all the members, so I know have read this. It's a quite lengthy statement. So maybe for the purpose of getting the best value out of the meeting itself, Dr. Hashemi, maybe you could maybe just abbreviate your what you want to say, maybe in 10 minutes or so, something like that, or 50, and we'll probably get more out of the meeting then, because I'll get the members to ask the questions and answers so that we can have over and back, so rather than having repetition.
Sure.
But can I welcome you indeed to today's meeting? And before I start, I need to ask members to remind members, witnesses, and those in the public gallery as well, to make sure that their mobile phones are switched off completely for the duration of the meeting, because they do cause interference, even in silent mode, with the recording equipment here in the committee rooms itself. And remember, today's meeting is going out live on TV. So it's important that you would switch off your phones. And again, I remind members of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person or body outside the Houses or an official, either by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. By virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the Joint Committee. If they are directed by the Chairman to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, they are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of their evidence. They are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and they are asked to respect the parliamentary practice that, where possible, they should not criticise and make charges against any person or entity by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. Okay, so Dr. Again, we'll get the proceedings on as quickly as possible, because as I said, some of the members have to leave at 3 o'clock. So Dr. Hashemi, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to be here today. Ladies and gentlemen, the rise of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria is a pivotal moment in international relations. I have spent most of my adult life studying the Middle East, traveling to it, researching and writing about it, teaching on the subject. I've never been more dispirited, more concerned, more disillusioned about the future of the Middle East than I am today, and it's directly related to the rise of what I call the ISIS crisis. Now is a moment for the international community to take pause and I think to seriously evaluate this particular crisis, which is not just a Middle Eastern crisis, it's a global crisis. The ISIS crisis is at the top of the international agenda. How did we get here? And critically, what can and what should the international community do about this particular crisis? And specifically, I want to ask and encourage the members of this committee to think about what particular contribution Ireland can make toward alleviating and resolving the ISIS crisis. Now, the roots of the ISIS crisis, I think, fundamentally are located in Syria. It does have Iraqi roots. In my document that I circulated, the background in Iraq, I think, is there. But we would not be having an ISIS crisis had there not been a conflict in Syria. Fundamentally, the failure of the international community to deal with the 3.5-year ongoing bloodshed and carnage in Syria has led to this particular moment, this crisis moment in international relations. According to the United Nations today, Syria represents the biggest humanitarian and moral crisis of the 21st century, replete with the displacement of nearly half of Syria's population, either as refugees or internally displaced, to the largest refugee crisis of the 21st century, to a human rights crisis that is borderline genocidal. The words state-sanctioned war crimes and crimes against humanity litter the human rights documentation on this particular conflict. There is a rape crisis in Syria, a child killing crisis in Syria. There is a public health crisis in Syria, a starvation crisis in Syria. But Syria is much more than all of this. Syria is also fundamentally a political crisis. The origins of the crisis in Syria that has produced ISIS goes back to March 2011 in the context of the Arab Spring, when there were pro-democracy protests against authoritarian regimes throughout the Middle East and North Africa. They eventually came to Syria. And it's important to remember that at least for the first 6 months of the Syrian uprising, these protests were nonviolent, they were non-sectarian, there was no ISIS to be found, there was no Al-Qaeda to be found. There was simply pro-democracy protesters protesting in the best spirit of Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, challenging a 41-year-old one-family rule. And it's a direct result of the brutality and the crackdown of the Assad regime on peaceful protesters that led to the militarization of that uprising, and then fundamentally to its Islamization and its extreme sort of development of a militant Islamic current known as the Islamic State. And it's important to point out that while all this was happening, the international community stood on the sidelines and watched things deteriorate. The general view that most people had is that, look, the UN Security Council was deadlocked. We couldn't do anything about it. Russia and China on one side, the United States and the European Union on the other, no agreement. We could pass a few resolutions, have a bunch of meetings, go to Geneva. Nothing fundamentally was done, and the situation kept getting worse. By the beginning of this year, in 2014, there was a general view that because of the deadlock, Syria simply had to burn itself out. No one wanted to take charge. No one wanted to speak up. And what happened is there was a general view that as bad as Syria was, what happened in Syria could be contained. That was the view of many realists in the United States. It didn't really affect the world. It didn't affect the United States. It didn't affect the West. That was the operating assumption, that Syria could be quote unquote contained. But we now know that the conflict in Syria cannot be contained. It has not been contained. It has spread over into Iraq. ISIS is now on the outskirts of Baghdad. They almost were in Iraqi Kurdistan, taking the major city of Erbil. The crisis in Syria has destabilized the entire region. And now, after a very significant Western, American-led troop deployment in Iraq and withdrawal of troops from Iraq and from the region, the United States and the world has had to reinvest and re-engage in the Middle East because of the broad failure of the international community to take the crisis in Syria seriously from the start. It's interesting to ask right now, had the international community sort of responded much more effectively earlier, would we be having this ISIS crisis today? And so I don't think it's it's useful for us to sort of go back and try and litigate what could have been done or what should have been done. I think what we need to deal with now is what can be done from this moment moving forward. And in this context, I think it's important to emphasize that the centrality of Syria to the ISIS crisis cannot be ignored or denied. The 5 Western hostages that were beheaded in Syria were beheaded by ISIS were beheaded in Syria. ISIS was reborn and reconstituted in Syria. According to U.S. intelligence estimates, 2/3 of ISIS military forces are located in Syria. There's no solution to the ISIS crisis without thinking about and debating a political solution for the future of Syria. These two things are deeply interlinked. And so the question here is what role can Ireland contribute to this particular crisis? And I'm here to argue and to encourage you to use the soft power that Ireland has in the global community, specifically in the Middle East, to help push this conflict in the right direction. Ireland has a very good reputation in the Middle East because of its own political history, struggling for self-determination, struggling for dignity, struggling for human rights, and also a very principled stand that Ireland has taken on the core identity issue of the Middle East, the Palestine-Israel crisis. The support for Palestinian self-determination has given Ireland, I think, a lot of goodwill. If Ireland were to speak up and sort of start to put Syria back on the agenda, specifically talking about how we can get to a political solution, I think the world will start to take notice. So here's a few things by way of conclusion that I think Ireland could be doing and should be doing to help push this particular conflict in the right direction toward a resolution. Number one, to support the struggle for self-determination, dignity, and democracy for the people of Syria that began 3.5 years ago in the context of a peaceful uprising against the Assad family. In keeping with that, there is a Friends of Syria group made up of several countries in the world that have supported the struggle for Syria. Ireland can join that particular group. Ireland can also join the 112 countries around the world that have designated the Syrian National Council as, quote, the legitimate representatives of the Syrian people in contrast to the Assad regime. Ireland can also support the moderate Syrian rebels who have been abandoned by the world by supporting the creation of a no-fly zone and a buffer zone where they can reconstitute themselves. There's no solution to the Syrian crisis unless moderate political forces can start fighting against ISIS and against Assad, who are basically two sides of the same coin, but we need those types of groups that are supported by the international community, including Ireland. Get behind the newly released document called the Syrian Freedom Charter. There's a new document circulating that comes out of Syrian civil society that is basically a blueprint for the future of a democratic Syria. It's based on the 1955 South African Freedom Charter. It's a great blueprint. Countries such as Ireland, with a good reputation, with a commitment to human rights and democracy, by lending support and voice to that particular document, can, I think, help push things forward politically. Get behind the recent French proposal. France has advocated a proposal that we should learn the lessons from the recent events in Kobani on the Syrian-Turkish border. Use that particular model to try and save Aleppo. Aleppo is a city, second major largest city in Syria. It's almost under complete siege by the Assad regime. There's a small element of moderate rebels who are still there. 300,000 people are about to be besieged. France has articulated a proposal in terms of how we can come to the rescue of those particular citizens and the moderate Syrian rebel forces. That's a plan that I think Ireland should be supporting in terms of advancing a resolution of this conflict. And as I say in my document, Jimmy Carter has put forward a 3-point peace proposal in terms of how to resolve the crisis in Syria. That's something that I think Ireland can lend support to. There's a number of UN resolutions that have been unenforced in terms of humanitarian aid. UN resolution, Security Council Resolution 2939 and UN Security Council Resolution 2165. Those are things that Ireland can give voice to. And finally, I think we need fundamentally a threefold strategy. a threefold strategy to push things forward by supporting moderate Syrian rebel forces. Number one, to defeat ISIS militarily. Number two, to remove the root causes of political extremism in Syria and in the region, and that's the Assad regime. And finally, to put in place a moderate government that will ensure that there'll be no rise of religious extremism and that Syria can begin to build a future that is inclusive, that is representative, and that is truly democratic. I'll stop there and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dr. Hashemi, and well done. Now, with the cooperation of the members, if I could get members to ask questions, and if you ask questions, I'll go over to Dr. Hashemi to answer them, and I'll let you back in again, rather than giving lengthy speeches that are good, that are no real use to. I think we're honoured to have Dr. Hashemi here, and he has said himself he wants Ireland to play a role here. So I know Deputy Crowe has to go to the chamber at 3 o'clock. So Deputy Crowe, if I could have some questions one or two questions, and I'll let you in again if you just have questions rather than speeches. Okay?
Just on
that's for everybody now.
The origins of ISIS, I would have thought that ISIS, as it emerged in Iraq in 2003 under the leadership of Abu Musab al-Sakari, then officially joined Al-Qaeda in 2004, adopted the name so on. And then you had the difficulty then with the Sunni tribes, with the Iraqi government. I just want to move it on from there in relation. There's a dispute over the number of men, the fighters that ISIS actually have under arms. There's estimates from 20,000 to 200,000. How many do you actually believe that they actually have there? In your opinion, how much of ISIS today is of genuine dissatisfied Sunnis from Iraq and the Sunnis and Syria, and many of them are actually foreign jihadis? One of the things that struck a lot of people, again, watching the conflict there, the extent of the modern weapons. They're saying they've got them from the collapse of the Iraqi army, but the fact that their ability and their ability, the technological know-how in relation to using those weapons, which would suggest then that a lot of them are possibly from the previous regime fighters and that. And again, maybe you could get into some of that. And it's the key to the fight, defeating ISIS, not only about military defeating, but also this whole debate about disaffected Sunnis in Iraq and Syria, and again, have their this, I presume, is the strategy of the American government, that's with the previous Maliki, his regime, that there was an agreement there with the Americans and others, and then they just there was no resources and so on, and that added to the tinderbox.
Yeah, no, I'll give you answer a few of those. I'll let you in again, okay? Because there's a lot of questions there. I don't want to get lost. Okay?
You're right. I think the problem that has produced ISIS in many ways is that the two existing states, the governments in Iraq and Syria, suffer from a deep crisis of illegitimacy. In the case of Iraq, about 20% of the population, the Sunni population, don't trust, feel that they've been marginalized, excluded by the existing Baghdad government. So the strategy that Obama has laid out is actually a strategy that I think in Iraq is going to work if we can stick to that strategy. In other words, you have to give the central government in Baghdad political legitimacy. You have to push it to be more inclusive, to bring in the Sunnis, to get them to turn away from Al-Qaeda as a voice for their political representation and their sort of set of grievances, and come back and work within the context of an Iraqi political union in a country that actually works. I think that's the right strategy. But that same strategy also needs to be applied to the case of Syria, because in Syria, the conflict is much more complicated. 70% of the population in Syria are Sunnis. They view the existing government in Baghdad as completely illegitimate and representative of a minority set of interests rooted in the Ba'ath Party and the Alawite sect. So those basic principles of political legitimacy as a way of dealing with the ISIS crisis, as a way of draining Sunni and dragging Sunni populations away from ISIS toward the central governments that are democratically inclusive, I think is the right strategy to pursue. But it's going to take a long time. because there's a lot of disillusionment, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of marginalization that has taken place. But broadly speaking, I think that's the way forward, and that's a role that the international community can play and should play. With respect to the troop questions, most of the reported figures have stated there's about 30 to 40,000 ISIS fighters. 200,000 I've never heard. 30 to 40,000, about half of them are foreign fighters. The vast majority are disgruntled Sunni young men from Iraq and Syria. Many of the foreign fighters are from neighboring Arab countries, from Morocco to as far as Indonesia. But the vast majority of them come from Iraq and Syria. And they come from Iraq and Syria largely because Sunni young men, as I just stated a moment ago, feel that their existing political systems are non-representative, unaccountable, unredeemable. And so they've joined ISIS as a way of trying to find some sort of hope for a better future. And so the challenge of draining away and drawing back or convincing young Sunni disgruntled men that their future lies with their own governments and not with this Islamic State is a long-term solution, but one that fundamentally has to be rooted in trying to increase the political legitimacy, the inclusiveness, the democratic nature of the existing political systems. And that's something that's not going to happen overnight, but it's going to take a long time. But I think laying out the plan that Obama has laid out with respect to Iraq is the right plan. The problem here is that President Obama has not said anything about a political solution for Syria, except the usual sort of general talking points. And as I said before, there's no solution to the ISIS crisis unless there's a solution for Syria's political future. That's the big, I think, question that sort of hangs over our heads and that needs to be dealt with.
You want to ask one more question, short question?
Just on the whole...
question, because I want to let other members in as well.
The issue of the Kurds and Kobani in particular, and the difficulty there. How do you feel Turkey's position on ISIS, particularly in relation to the PKK? And there's been Patrick Coburn, which was one of the speakers who suggested here. He was saying that the rhetoric between the Turkish and Kurdish sides, have got worse, and so the Kurdish thing, the Kobani, what's happening there, and the impact that's going to have on possibly the ceasefire that's in operation tomorrow.
I'm glad you mentioned Kobani, because we often hear that there's no military solution to the crisis in Syria. There's only a political solution. I'm of a different view. I'm of a view that there needs to be a political solution, but that political solution can only be arrived at if we have a military component to it. And Kobani is a perfect test case for that. To say that there's no military solution to Syria is to basically abandon the people of Kobani to the ISIS fighters. Kobani effectively has been saved in the last few weeks because of the significant support that has been given to it as a result of U.S. airstrikes, as a result of sending in Kurdish fighters and an arm drop and drops of sort of armaments. That has sort of shifted the tide in terms of the fighting of Kobani. When we started looking at this particular city, it looked like it was about to fall. But because of significant military support, the tide of the war has shifted, and now things look much better for the people of Kobani. I think that particular model needs to be applied in other parts of Syria as a way of pressuring the Assad regime to come to the negotiating table. Assad is not going to come to the negotiating table and negotiate anything unless he's forced to do so. So I think that's the broader, model that can be, and that's really what the French proposal is all about. So this is not something that I'm sort of coming up with. The foreign minister of France has a Kobani sort of military political plan on the table right now. With respect to Turkey's role, Turkey has conflicting roles in the region. It has its own Kurdish sort of minority problem. It also has a broader regional sort of set of interests. And Turkey has been trying to sort of leverage its geographic position to get the United States to commit to a much more serious long-term political plan for the future of Syria. Turkey effectively told the Obama administration, we will come to the rescue of the people of Kobani on the condition that you agree to a no-fly zone, you agree to sort of go after the Assad regime, you agree to do what should have been done 3.5 years ago. Obama, for reasons that we can talk about, has been very reluctant to get into a deeper engagement with respect to dealing with the political solution in Syria. And a lot of that, in my view, has to do with the negotiations that are going on with Iran right now. We can talk about that if you'd like. But Turkey's position is one of regional power. I'm of the view that there's not going to be a solution to Syria unless Turkey is actually brought on board. Geographically, in terms of Turkey's position within in the world, it's a relationship with Western countries. Turkey is destined to play an important role. So I think Turkey has to be part of a broader solution in terms of how we sort of solve this broader crisis of ISIS. To ignore Turkey, I think, is to make the ISIS crisis much more difficult.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Deputy Crowe, as well. Deputy Sullivan, I know you're anxious maybe to get away as well.
Thank you very much. It's just a pity the day you came in because of what's going on, because there's so much more I think that I would have liked to have been able to tease out. When you were talking about the Kobani model, obviously you meant the military aspect of it. So I have one question around the Kurdish people, because they have lost out in so many other conflicts, you know, that they have been to the fore in contributing or whatever, and then when the conflict is over, they're left with less land than they possibly had starting out. So that would be one area I'd be interested in. You know, you're talking about removing President Assad. I mean, he's not moving anywhere. So is there any way that he can be, that there can be some negotiations with him? You mentioned the Syrian National Council, and I'm just wondering where they are at this particular stage. And I suppose over all of them, you talk about moderate government, etc. I think of Libya. And they overthrew Gaddafi, and I would think people would agree it's in a worse state now than it was under Colonel Gaddafi. And all of their attempts at moderate government, etc., it's in an appalling state now, and I think that's an area, possibly because of Syria and ISIS, it's not getting the attention that it should get. And you mentioned Iran, and again, a major player, and where are they? Because they were excluded from the talks initially, and I think that was a mistake.
Thanks very much, Deputy Sullivan.
Okay, so very quickly, you're right. The Kurds have been treated very badly in the modern history of the Middle East. Their sad fate is that they're divided between 4 countries. But I think any solution to a stable Middle East must include recognition of Kurdish national and cultural rights. There's no support in the international community for an independent Kurdistan, despite what we hear about the withering away of the World War I borders. But I think there is a lot of support for federal political systems in the region, in Iraq, and in a future Syria that grants groups such as the Kurds full cultural, autonomous, and even national recognition, but within the existing framework of Iraq and Syria and in Turkey. I think that's what already has been happening in the case of Iraq. I mean, the Kurds in Iraq basically are autonomous. I think that's what needs to happen in a future Syria. I think that is what is beginning to happen in the case of Turkey. There's been actually some movement in terms of Turkey's relationship with the Kurds, a de-escalation of that particular conflict. I think that's something that the international committee should be pushing. In terms of Assad's future, you're right. Assad isn't going anywhere. But let's be clear why he's not going anywhere. Assad is not going anywhere because he has strong support from Russia, from Iran, and from Hezbollah, and the international community has basically stood on the sidelines for the last 3.5 years and abandoned the moderate Syrian rebels. Assad is not going to go anywhere until he's actually pushed to go somewhere. He's not going to give up 41 years or 44 years of one-family rule just because of some pro-democracy protests that happened 3.5 years ago. But Assad, I think, will be forced to concede some of his position that he holds right now, if he's pressed to do so. If the Russian position is challenged in the Security Council, if Iran's position in the region is challenged by the global community, there's no stability in Syria or the broader Middle East as long as Assad stays in power. I was very happy to hear the statement, I think, in this committee last week by the Irish Foreign Affairs Minister, who sort of made that exact same point. So I think that's the right policy. Ireland seems to be on that track, and I think it needs to stay on that track. Finally, with respect to Libya and Syria, you're right. Libya is a disaster now. But it's a disaster because after the international community came to the aid of the Libyan people to overthrow Gaddafi, they basically abandoned the Libyan people. And I think there's lessons to be learned here. So when we talk about a future stable Syria, the lesson from Libya is that it's not simply good enough to topple the dictator. There has to be a plan for stabilization, reconstruction, peacekeeping, in which Ireland can play a role in the aftermath, or else you're prone to get the dissolution of the state, war and anarchy and breakdown, and the possibility of a repeat scenario in Syria along the Libyan model. So that's something that we don't want to see happen. And so built into the plan, built into any sort of peace plan, has to be a post-conflict reconstruction and stabilization plan. That has to be a central element.
Thanks very much indeed. Senator Walsh. Any questions, Senator? If you
And just to thank Dr. Hashemi, it's a very interesting and insightful paper, I think, that you've given us. Just some questions on it. In the root causes, I mean, what is it in the psyche or in the mindset of a significant minority of Islamists or Muslims that actually leads to such barbaric atrocities being committed? I don't remember reading a book many, many years ago about Muhammad. And not only was he a prophet, but he was also a military leader of the day in the 7th century. And I'm just wondering, is there a kind of an undercurrent within that that's been abused? Secondly,
no, I'll just maybe I'll get back to you then again, but maybe that's that question, because it's a very good question.
Yeah, it's a very important question, but the root causes, in my view, have much less to do with religion and much more to do with politics. And what I mean by that is the following. The roots of the ISIS crisis is fundamentally to be located in the broken politics of the Middle East. The broken politics of the Middle East, which is a function of two converging variables that have produced the ISIS crisis. Number one, the legacy of political tyranny and political despotism that has characterized the politics of the region and that has been most manifested in the two countries that have been most adversely affected by the legacy of political tyranny, Iraq and Syria. Compare the countries of the Arab League. Iraq and Syria are the two countries whose post-colonial political condition has been most severely detrimented and decimated by political authoritarianism and tyranny. The human rights record, for example, of the Ba'ath Party under Assad and under Saddam Hussein has really devastated these societies. So that's, I think, a main cause. The other main cause is simply Iraq and Syria have been devastated by the predictable consequences of state breakdown that has resulted from ongoing war. So the state in Iraq and Syria no longer function as a normal state. Iraq has been under constant war for the last 35 years. Iran-Iraq war, Iraq-Kuwait war, devastating sanctions, the American occupation from 2003 until today. It's a devastated society. Syria has been the site of the worst humanitarian and moral crisis of the 21st century, borderline genocidal conditions. The state has withered away, and it's in this vacuum that has been produced by state breakdown and war, and also the legacy of political tyranny and chaos, that ISIS emerges to fill a vacuum and provides a narrative. Most of the people who come from and join ISIS are people who have been born and bred and raised in politically authoritarian, tyrannical societies where the state has broken down and where they or their families have been either in political prison, have been suffocated, have been scared. This is the enveloping context that produced the ISIS crisis. And you have to ask yourself, why Iraq and Syria? If this is a religious question, if this is a problem of Islam, how come in those parts of the Muslim world where Muslims are in the greatest majority, Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, you don't see these things happening? You see them happening in Iraq and Syria precisely for the reasons that I mentioned. The predictable consequences of the convergence of the legacy of political tyranny and state breakdown, war, and chaos that put together creates a fertile soil for this particular group to emerge. Now, on top of that, religion is important here. There is a particular theological interpretation of people who subscribe to the ISIS worldview that comes out of a puritanical, ultra-conservative, anti-humanistic, and intolerant interpretation of Islam rooted in the Arabian Peninsula, coming out of the Wahhabi creed of Islam. If you look at the theological interpretation of ISIS, the books that they're using in their classrooms, the intolerance, the beheadings, the animosity toward Shia, the animosity toward women, the animosity toward culture, the animosity toward people who are minorities, all of this is straight out of the playbook of a particular puritanical and ultra-conservative orientation that comes out of the Saudi Peninsula. You don't see this in other parts of the Islamic world. Actually, we do start to see it in the later half of the 20th century, largely as a result of the marriage of Wahhabi Islam, ultra-conservative puritanical Islam, and the development of oil and the wealth that is generated in the Persian Gulf area that allows this particular interpretation of Islam to be decimated. So if you look at the whole history of Islam, 1400 years, you don't see these types of manifestations of Islam. You're seeing them happening at particularly certain moments in certain places in time because of the convergence of what I would call three factors: state breakdown and war, the legacy of political tyranny, and also this ultra-puritanical conservative interpretation of Islam. Put it all together and you get ISIS.
I'll let you get Senator Walsh.
On that, yeah.
No, a different question if you can now. Because
But I just want to follow through on the thread. I mean, I go part of the way with what you're saying, maybe a good bit of the way, but many of those who are fighting there come from the Western world, come from different families, some of them converts to Islam. So, you know, some of that prognosis doesn't answer that. Now, if it just,
I'll be happy.
The other thing is, why is there so few Muslim leaders and Muslim states condemning these atrocities? I mean, that seems to be absent. And there's also the role, which you alluded to there, Saudi Arabia, but there's the role of Qatar as well. And not alone maybe are they funneling the ideology, but in fact, they're also funding it. And when you look at other authoritarian regimes in the Arab world, it actually has transpired that when they move to more, what appeared in parentheses as more democratic structures, in fact, it transpired that the minorities, particularly Christians in those areas, but also other minority religious groups, they actually, who had lived there peacefully, even under some of these authoritarian rulers, now found themselves, after a couple of thousand years, actually being targeted and rooted out. And I mean, that's a huge scandal. And I think that's a huge...
For the question on that.
Yeah, just asking, would you agree that that's a huge blemish on Islam? And I also just want to put one final question to you. You say about saving Aleppo. And in Iraq, there is a legitimate government there. And Obama, as you mentioned, you know, backed that and is supporting it. There's a logic to that. But I mean, the choice in Syria is between a very discredited regime who are in power, or a worse discredited and atrocious barbaric terrorists group that would actually take over. So I mean, really, the choice there is almost impossible to make a decision on who you back or who you decide. You appear to be coming down against Assad, but surely the first thing has to be done is to defeat ISIS. And would you agree that that's going to mean boots on the ground from some international?
Thanks very much, Senator Walsh.
So very quickly, there's a third choice. The third choice is a choice that the international community did not pursue, and that led to where we are today. To support the peaceful, non-violent protesters that began this particular conflict, to support today the moderate Syrian rebels who I think provide an alternative to Assad and an alternative to ISIS. That's, I think, the third alternative that hasn't been pursued. We have to start from the drawing board again because, you know, they've been decimated. They're the weakest party to this conflict. That's the third option that I think can be pursued and should be pursued because that's the only way we're going to get to a stable sort of, you know, future Syria, by supporting those people who are committed to basic principles of human rights and democracy. That's the third issue. With respect to, you know, your earlier comments on religion and Islam, you know, I have to disagree with you. I think the reason why you sort of, first of all, you're absolutely wrong when you say that there's been no condemnation by Muslims of ISIS. In fact, I challenge you to find any mainstream or even, a marginal Muslim group that's actually supported ISIS. I get this question all the time, and I've got a list on my website where every single major Muslim organization that I know of has issued condemnations of ISIS. Not only that, but there's been over 300 leading Muslim scholars who've gone through and issued this public document going point by point, pointing out how ISIS interpretation of Islam is a violation of mainstream interpretations of Islam. So there's been broad condemnation, and I'd be happy to share that document with you if it'll help you with your own work. I don't think you can sort of, compare the predictable consequences of Qatari foreign policy and the type of Islam that comes out of Qatar with that of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has been producing, promoting, disseminating a very intolerant and puritanical interpretation of Islam for at least the last 50 years. The reach of Saudi oil money, the scholarships that are given to students from around the Islamic world to come to Saudi Arabia to internalize a particular intolerant interpretation of Islam and then go back and spread it in their own communities has been a long-standing story. It's been well documented, and it is partly responsible for producing this particular intolerant interpretation of Islam that has now manifested itself in the case of ISIS. The challenge is to try and promote and support those interpretations of Islam that are more inclusive, that are more tolerant, and as you know from your own country's experience, religion can be interpreted in many different ways. Exclusive, intolerant, backward ways, but also the converse, tolerant, ecumenical, inclusive interpretations. And I think Ireland and the rest of the international community has, I think, a deep interest in trying to support those forces, those voices who are promoting that latter interpretation of Islam. Because you're not going to get away from the question of religion. The Islamic world is deeply religious, but we have an interest in promoting more tolerant and inclusive interpretations of Islam, of which there are many expressions. They just don't have the same type of financial backing from oil money that this ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam has.
Okay, I'll let you in again after, if we're finished, the other members, if you want to get to reply again. I want to get all the other members in as well. Senator Mullins wants to come in there.
Just to follow on Senator Walsh, in relation to the support for the moderate rebels that you talked about, the moderate forces. How representative are they, or how strong are they? Would you have any concerns that obviously if you militarily support them, that you're now going to have, if you like, three factions very strongly militarily supported? Is that not going to lead to further loss of life, further bloodshed, further human rights violations? And obviously, as a country, I know one of the issues you raised there with us that you would like us to support the struggle for democracy in Syria, and obviously, as a democratic country, we very strongly want to support every efforts to install a strong democratic regime in every country. But what you might flesh out for me a little bit more is the Syrian Freedom Charter that you referred to. What exactly does that contain, and how, and what role can that play in hopefully resolving?
Let him answer those two questions, and I'll let you back in again then. Okay.
In 1955, the South African pro-democracy movement, led by the African National Congress, produced a document that you heard of called the South African Freedom Charter. It basically was a blueprint for a future post-apartheid South Africa. Looking back, we see that that particular document actually did play a role in terms of bringing different political constituencies around a common agenda. The civil society organizations led by the local coordinating councils in Syria, which have representation throughout the country, have produced a similar document based on the South African blueprint. And it's basically an inclusive sort of document for democracy and human rights and civil society that lays out a blueprint for a future Syria. It's not a document that's been dreamt up by a handful of sort of activists. It's based on the most detailed survey of Syrian public opinion ever conducted. 50,000 surveys from people across Syria in every single district, and including in the exile community, people who've been, kicked out and who've been turned refugees, have sort of voiced their opinion, filled out these surveys. And you have a document here that I would argue is far more representative than anything that we've seen in the history of modern Syria. I think that's a document that I think Ireland, the international community, can get behind, because it's the embodiment of the values that we subscribe to in Western liberal democracies. It's also a reflection of Syrian views. This is something that I think, is representative, and it overlaps with the views of the moderate Syrian rebels. If you look at what they've stood for, they stand for essentially the Freedom Charter principles. It's a new document. You're going to see a lot more about it. It's just been released. You're going to see much more about it, and I encourage you to sort of find out more about this particular document. Yes, if we support the Syrian Free Syrian Army right now, who's the weakest of the three different groups, we're going to prolong the conflict. But I would argue that not supporting them is to guarantee that Syria's future will be mired in conflict, resistance, a war of attrition that will constantly keep producing instability as long as the Assad regime and as long as ISIS stays in power. There's some conflicts where, unfortunately, you have to invest in a military struggle to defeat those political parties that simply are not willing to compromise, not willing to share power. We are in this particular crisis because of ISIS, because of Assad's obfuscation, gerrymandering of the political system, and his authoritarian policies. He doesn't want to leave. And so there's no way out of the, I think, problem of Syria unless you use a military solution as part of a broader political sort of agenda. They have to go together. You can't separate them. And so I think that's how we have to start thinking about this particular solution. I think if we start thinking about it in those terms, emboldened by the Freedom Charter principles, we can start to move this conflict in a much positive and better direction than it is currently.
Okay, Mr. Mullins, do you want to come in there again one more?
I'm okay for that.
Okay, Deputy Byrne. So.
Yeah, God, what a complex crisis we have. To extend our sympathy, obviously, to the people of Syria who have suffered, and I think they're heading into the winter months now. Horrendous, from a very sophisticated, wealthy, middle-class society to what it is today. There's two issues that concern me. One is, while I can accept and applaud your outline as to how Ireland plays a role in finding the solution, I want to put two questions to you. It is startling to hear the figures of 50% of the ISIL fighters being non-Syrian. It's frightening to think that British and now 2 French ISIL people have been connected with the beheadings of all people, aid workers. So, you explained to us that your belief is that from the chaos and the dictatorship and the horrible leadership of within Syria and Iraq, it bred this sandstorm, this volcano, and one could accept that. But where and what is the attraction for the 50% of the fighters who aren't coming from that culture? That is a big worry. I don't want to be simplistic, but it would seem to me that there has to be a religious motivation by people to leave from Ireland, from England, from France, as Muslims, to go and fight exclusively with ISIL. That's the first thing. The second one is your request that we should support, basically, and we'd like to support those weak democratic forces. But already I think I've read in the papers that ISIL has defeated what was to be a stronghold of these democratic fighters only last week. Would you not agree that, you know, with the power of Russia and its influence on China to some degree, but in particular, the key players of Saudi Arabia and Iran, that unless those 2 major Islamic states are forced into some sort of a compromise, the region will always be destabilized? And I'm thinking, for example, we had people in here from Iran. They would say things are wonderful under all these kingdoms. We've had people in from Morocco who would say that all these kingdoms are fundamentally undemocratic. But you can see the Shia sort of tensions in Bahrain. You can see the response by, I think, the Sunni leaders. So my question to you is, are the key players not Saudi Arabia and Iran together? And if you could explain to me why all these 50% of these fighters are